Harper Audio presents Fracture, Barack Obama, the Clintons, and the Racial Divide by Joy-Ann Reid. Read for you by the author. Introduction. If you were a black kid growing up in the United States in the 1970s and 80s, and you lived in a house like the one I grew up in, where we read the newspaper every morning, watched the evening news and Nightline, and rarely missed the Sunday talk shows, you knew that when you were old enough to vote, you would be a Democrat. The Democrats were our party. The Republicans were their party. Sure, occasionally you heard about black Republicans here and there, but they were the exception. The stuffy business types with the perfectly symmetrical corporate afros, the old Southerners who like to go on and on about the party of Abraham Lincoln, or Republican wannabes, like my Congolese father, who didn't live in the United States and so only knew the political parties as an abstraction. For most black Americans, being political meant being a Democrat. Or, in my Guyanese immigrant single mother's parlance, this was the party of Shirley Chisholm and Jack Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson and civil rights. Run, Jesse, run, and where's the beef? The hilarious Wendy's TV commercial slogan appropriated by doomed presidential candidate Walter Mondale. My mother didn't care that he had no chance of beating Ronald Reagan. She loved that line. The message that we are Democrats was all but piped into my ideological DNA. When Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in 1980, my sister and I burst out crying. She was in the 7th grade and I was in the 6th. We didn't bother crying over Mondale. It was pretty clear early on that his cause was lost. The first vote I cast in a presidential primary was for Jesse Jackson, and my first vote for a presidential candidate was for Michael Dukakis. My sister canvassed for Gary Hart after school. I started working in the TV news business in 1998 and briefly left it in 2004 to work for the election of a Democratic president. I did so again in 2008. But the party that seemed almost organically to be my natural political home wasn't always so. The Democratic Party's transformation from representing the antebellum South, known for its massive resistance to integration and literal terrorism against black citizens, to the party that represented the vast majority of black Americans, whether descended from the enslaved or newly minted as U.S. citizens, and ultimately to the party that produced the nation's first black president, was one of the most dramatic turnabouts in American political history. It came through the crucible of a white Southern president, Lyndon Johnson, whose civil rights triumphs were quickly overwhelmed by a war that split him from the very coalition that had brought about such veritable miracles of civil rights and civic justice. And it came at a cost. After Johnson and the tumult of the 1968 election, which saw the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and ultimately the election of Richard Nixon, the Democratic Party spent decades wrangling with his legacy, often disowning it, as the party struggled to regain favor with increasingly resentful white voters up north, and to stem the flight of white voters down south as it continued to pursue the elusive White House. As Republicans essentially took over as the party of Southern conservatives, Democrats struggled to reconcile their newly robust multiracial character with the changing politics of the country. From Richard Nixon to Ronald Reagan, Republican presidential candidates nurtured and profited from the white working class's growing sense of grievance over those Johnson-era programs that attempted to add economic stability to the cadre of basic rights secured for African Americans and poor whites. For Democrats, race would be both an elevator under their feet, growing their voter rolls, particularly in the southern states, and putting presidential elections within closer reach, and an anchor around their necks, shrinking their popularity with white working-class voters for a generation. By the time Barack...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?